the unraveling of the word, oaths, trust, and the crisis of integrity in the modern West. Section 1, the sanctity of the word, oaths, covenants, and the divine compact. The foundational structures of society, its laws, its government, its ethical codes, rest upon a bedrock of promises. The assertion that these pillars are based on something as seemingly ephemeral as a man's word is not an exaggeration but a profound historical truth. For millennia, the sworn oath was not merely a statement of intent but a sacred act, a powerful and tangible force that invoked cosmic order and divine judgment, binding the individual to the collective. To understand the modern crisis of trust, one must first appreciate the historical sanctity of the word, a concept that has been systematically dismantled over centuries. The modern perception of a promise as something that doesn't exist stems not from an inherent emptiness in the concept itself, but from the gradual disappearance of the divine and social enforcers that once gave the word its formidable weight. 1.1 The oath is political cement, binding the citizen to the state. In the ancient world, the oath was the primary mechanism for creating and sustaining political obligation. It was the very cement of the polis, transforming disparate individuals into a coherent body politic. In ancient Greece, for instance, the prevailing belief was that adherence to oaths was the principal reason citizens obeyed the law. The most famous example, the Athenian ephebic oath, was sworn by young men as they entered military service. It was not a vague platitude but an explicit commitment, I shall not disgrace my sacred arms. I will transmit my fatherland, not only not less, but greater and better, than it was transmitted to me. I will obey the magistrates who may at any time be in power, and the established laws and whatever laws may be established. The orator Lycurgus argued that the oath was nothing less than the power which keeps our democracy together. This practice was not unique to Athens. In Rome, the act of assuming public office was sanctified by an oath sworn to Jupiter himself. Officials would swear upon an oath stone, a physical representation of the god in his role as the divine lawmaker and keeper of order. The consequences of breaking such a vow were not merely political but spiritual. The perjurer could expect punishment from Orcus, the god of the underworld who punished the violators of sacred oaths. Crucially, these ancient oaths functioned differently from modern notions of consent. Contemporary political philosophy, particularly since John Locke, posits that for consent to be binding, it must be given voluntarily by an individual who is fully aware of their choice. However, in the deeply integrated societies of the ancient world, it is unlikely that these conditions were met. An Athenian youth, compelled into military service and embedded within the fabric of his family, phratry, and deme since birth, did not choose to become a citizen in the way a modern individual chooses to sign a contract. Rather, he grew into his civic obligations, much as one grows into familial duties. The oath, therefore, was not constitutive of these obligations but declarative, a solemn, public ritual that called attention to and reinforced a pre-existing moral and social reality. The power of the oath lay in its ability to make this implicit social bond explicit and to place it under the watchful eyes of the gods. 1.2 The covenant as divine law, God's word as the ultimate bond. If the political oath bound man to the state, the divine covenant bound man to God, establishing the ultimate archetype of a binding, unalterable word. In the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the relationship between the divine and humanity is framed as a series of formal, solemn agreements, or covenants. These are not mere promises but cosmic legal documents that establish the very structure of reality and redemption. The Hebrew word for covenant, berith, appears over 260 times in the Masoretic text, underscoring its centrality. These covenants, such as the Noahic, Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic, provide the skeletal framework for how the whole biblical story holds together, defining the terms, promises, and conditions of the relationship between God and his people. The sacred texts that contain these covenants are themselves presented as immutable legal documents. The authority of Scripture is predicated on its perfection and unchangeable nature. God's command in Deuteronomy 4:2 is absolute, Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it. The Bible concludes with a similar, dire warning in Revelation 22:18-19, promising plagues upon anyone who adds to the prophecy and removal from the book of life for anyone who takes away from it. This theological principle establishes a powerful precedent, that the most important truths are codified in a perfect, inviolable text. Any alteration would invalidate the covenant and undermine the authority of God himself. This concept of a divinely authored, legally binding, and unalterable text provides the deepest cultural and philosophical roots for the Western understanding of a contract. The idea that a set of words can be eternally binding and carry severe penalties for violation is a direct inheritance from theological frameworks where God's law was understood as the supreme and unchanging reality. Similarly, Islamic Sharia law is understood not as a human invention but as a divine legal framework rooted in the Quran, the Word of Allah, and the Sunnah, providing a comprehensive pathway towards righteousness and divine justice. In this context, a promise is not a social convention but a reflection of cosmic order. The lament for the loss of a man's word is, at its deepest level, a lament for the loss of a society grounded in the certainty of a divine legal framework. 1.3 The philosophical weight of a promise, invoking honor and consequence. Distilled to its philosophical essence, an oath is a unique speech act that transcends a simple promise. A promise states an intention. An oath performs a commitment by binding the speaker's honor and integrity to a future action and publicly inviting consequences for failure. Traditionally, this was achieved by calling to witness a higher power, God or the gods, to bolster the claim to veracity. This invocation was the oath's enforcement mechanism. Perjury was not merely a lie, but a sacrilegious offense that invited divine retribution, a concept that lent profound gravity to legal and civic proceedings in cultures from ancient Greece to medieval Europe. The oath's power, therefore, was never in the words themselves but in the shared, unquestioned belief in the witness and enforcer. The modern view of an oath as potentially hollow or non-existent arises from the erosion of belief in that divine enforcer. As societies secularized, the cosmic guarantor of the promise receded, leaving the words to stand on their own, seemingly unsupported. Yet, even in a secular context, the oath retains a shadow of its former power by invoking social and legal consequences. When a witness in a modern court swears an oath, they bind themselves not only to a potential charge of perjury, a legal punishment, but also to the judgment of their community. The oath remains a public performance designed to show sincerity by staking one's reputation on the truth of one's words. It evokes a sense of morality even in the atheist by focusing the mind on a solemn duty and linking personal honor to the act of speaking truthfully. It is a recognition that for society to function, there must be moments where words are elevated beyond casual conversation and imbued with the full weight of personal and social accountability. Section 2, The Social Contract, Institutionalizing the Promise in Law and Government. The transition from the ancient to the modern world involved a monumental shift in the nature of the foundational promise. The personal, honor-based, and divinely sanctioned oath sworn between individuals or to a local ruler was gradually abstracted and formalized into the impersonal structures of the modern nation-state. This transformation was driven by the philosophical engine of social contract theory, which reimagined the state not as a divinely ordained hierarchy but as a rational, collective agreement. This secularized covenant found its most prominent real-world application in the U.S. Constitution, where the oath of office became the critical ritual for perpetuating and re-embodying the abstract promise of the state. 2.1 From personal promise to abstract polity, the social contract theorists. Social contract theory provided the intellectual bridge from the ancient world of personal fealty to the modern world of institutional governance. Thinkers of the Enlightenment sought to ground political obligation not in divine right or inherited status, but in reason and consent. They did this by positing a hypothetical state of nature, a condition of humanity before the existence of government, to justify why rational individuals would voluntarily agree to form a society. The structure of this philosophical exercise closely mirrors that of a religious covenant. It involves a promise. Individuals cede certain freedoms, a higher power, the sovereign or the general will, established conditions, obeying the law, and promised benefits, security and the protection of rights. The crucial difference is that the ultimate authority is transferred from God to a human-made political entity. In effect, social contract theory is an attempt to create a foundation for political legitimacy that retains the binding power of a covenant without requiring divine revelation. The major theorists offered different versions of this contract. Thomas Hobbes, writing in The Shadow of the English Civil War, depicted the state of nature as a brutal war of all against all, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, Rational individuals would willingly surrender nearly all of their freedoms to an absolute sovereign in exchange for the most basic benefit, protection from chaos and violent death. John Locke presented a more optimistic view, arguing that the state of nature was governed by a law of nature in which individuals possessed inherent rights to life, liberty and estate. The problem was the lack of an impartial judge to settle disputes. Therefore, people would consent to form a government to act as a neutral judge, protecting their pre-existing rights. For Locke, government legitimacy comes directly from the consent of the governed. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in turn, argued for a more radical contract in which individuals surrender all their rights to the community as a whole, creating a general will that represents the collective good. In obeying the law, which is an expression of this general will, the individual is not losing freedom but achieving a higher, civic freedom. 2.2 The U.S. Constitution as National Covenant, the Oath of Office. The U.S. Constitution stands as the most ambitious real-world attempt to instantiate a social contract. The document itself is a written covenant, and the oath of office is the recurring ritual that binds individuals to uphold it. The founders considered this ritual so essential that the very first act passed by the first U.S. Congress in 1789 was to establish an oath of office. The Constitution itself explicitly prescribes the wording for the presidential oath, Article 2, Section 1, and mandates in Article 6 that all legislative, executive, and judicial officers shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. This act of swearing allegiance is laden with significance. It signifies that the Constitution is an objective text with an interpretable meaning, not a malleable document subject to the private interpretation of any particular man. By taking the oath, an official makes a solemn promise to uphold the rule of law, subordinating their personal preferences and political whims to the established legal framework. The history of the oath reveals how its function changes in response to crises of trust. The simple 1789 oath, "I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support the Constitution of the United States," was deemed insufficient during the Civil War, a period of profound national division and uncertain loyalties. In 1862, Congress enacted the Ironclad Test Oath, a far more stringent and coercive promise. It required officials to swear not only future allegiance but also past loyalty, affirming that they had never voluntarily borne arms against the United States or given aid to its enemies. Those who swore falsely were subject to prosecution for perjury and barred from federal employment. This evolution demonstrates a critical principle: when the implicit trust in an official's word evaporates, the state must make the promise more explicit, detailed, and punitive. The modern oath taken by federal officials retains the echoes of this crisis. It includes the language to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and the explicit declaration, "I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion." This wording reveals that the oath is not merely a passive promise, but an act of defense against perceived threats and a bulwark against deceit. While an official takes the oath freely, they are entering a pre-existing system of governance and law. Refusing the oath results in exclusion from power, not a negation of the system's authority. In this way, the oath of office functions much like the ancient Athenian oath. It is a declarative and coercive ritual that reinforces an existing power structure, a formal acknowledgement of a social contract that is presumed to be in force for all. Section 3, The Fading Echo, From Personal Honor to Impersonal Systems. The modern sense of a man's word being devalued is a direct consequence of a centuries-long societal transformation, the deliberate and systematic replacement of trust in people with trust in systems. As Western societies grew larger, more anonymous, and more complex, the informal mechanisms of personal honor became untenable as the primary basis for social order. In their place, societies constructed vast, impersonal edifices of law and regulation. This shift, while intended to create fairness and predictability, came at a cost: the alienation and perceived degradation of the personal, binding promise. 3.1 The Great Divorce, Cultures of Honor versus Cultures of Law. Societies can be broadly understood as operating on one of two principles for enforcing commitments: honor or law. A culture of honor, which characterized much of human history, relies on personal reputation and the enforcement of social norms through mechanisms like praise, gossip, and shame. In such a system, one's honor, a perceived quality of worthiness and respectability, is a tangible asset. In the community where formal courts are weak or non-existent, A reputation for keeping one's word is invaluable for commerce and social cooperation. The classic handshake deal is a feature of an honor culture, where the social consequences of breaking one's word are severe enough to make the promise binding. However, the conditions that sustain an honor culture, small, stable communities with shared values and a scarcity of resources, were systematically eroded in the West by several forces. Urbanization created anonymity, severing the link between personal action and public reputation. Industrialization and capitalism fostered a more mobile and individualistic society. Growing diversity introduced conflicting value systems, making a single, shared honor code impossible to maintain. In a large, anonymous city, a person can break promises with little fear of the community-wide shaming that would have occurred in a small village. As the culture of honor declined, it was necessarily replaced by a culture of law. In a law-based culture, society creates a body of explicit rules and delegates the power of enforcement to impartial, impersonal institutions like police and courts. This represents a fundamental social contract. Citizens give up their personal right to enforce agreements and retaliate for injuries, and in return, the state provides a neutral mechanism for justice. The modern business world reflects this shift perfectly. The handshake deal is now widely seen as a very bad idea, precisely because the social enforcement of honor has vanished. In a litigious and anonymous society, verbal agreements are easily forgotten, misinterpreted, or denied, making detailed, written contracts an absolute necessity for predictable and enforceable commerce. 3.2 The codification of trust, the rise of contract law and the regulatory state. The history of modern contract law and the regulatory state is the story of society creating external systems to perform the functions that it no longer trusts individuals to perform on their own. Each new regulation, statute, and government agency can be seen as a monument to a specific failure of interpersonal trust or self-regulation. The law of contract evolved specifically to meet the needs of a commercial civilization where informal, honor-based agreements were no longer sufficient. Beginning in the Middle Ages, merchant courts and common law developed actions to enforce promises made outside the old requirements of a formal seal. By the 19th century, the doctrine of freedom of contract became dominant, but this principle often masked vast inequalities in bargaining power between large corporations and individuals. This led to a new wave of codification in the 20th century, with legislation designed to protect consumers, employees, and tenants from unfair terms, further removing relationships from the realm of personal agreement to that of legal stipulation. The rise of the regulatory state followed a similar logic. The first major U.S. regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission (ICC), was established in 1887 because Congress acknowledged it lacked the specialized expertise to regulate the increasingly complex and powerful railroad industry. This act of creating an agency of experts to set and enforce rules marked a profound shift. Trust was being outsourced from elected representatives and the public to quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial bureaucratic bodies. This trend exploded during the New Deal of the 1930s with the creation of agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) to police financial markets after the 1929 crash, and continued through the 1970s with agencies for social regulation like the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration (OSHA). The entire administrative state is, in essence, an institutional framework built on the premise of distrust, a system designed to compel behavior that society can no longer rely on honor or personal integrity to produce. 3.3 Microcosm of decay, the evolution of the Hippocratic Oath. The transformation of the Hippocratic Oath serves as a powerful case study for the societal shift from sacred, personal vows to secular, institutionalized ethics. The oath's journey mirrors the broader displacement of the man's word by systemic processes. The original oath, likely written in the 4th or 5th century BC, was a profound religious covenant. The physician began by swearing to a pantheon of healing gods, Apollo physician and Asclepius and Hygeia and Panacea, making them witnesses to his promise. It was a personal, moral commitment containing absolute and unambiguous prohibitions. The physician vowed not to give a deadly drug, not to give an abortive remedy, and to refrain from use of the knife, a task then left to surgical specialists. The enforcement mechanism was divine, and the commitment was absolute. In stark contrast, the oaths sworn by most medical students today are heavily modified, secularized documents. Modern versions, like the 1938 Declaration of Geneva or the popular Lasagna Oath, have removed the invocation to Greek gods, often replacing it with a pledge to whatever each of us holds most sacred or simply a general promise to uphold medical principles. The absolute prohibitions have vanished, reflecting a world with legalized abortion and complex ethical debates around euthanasia and end-of-life care. This modernization has led to sharp criticism that the oath has been diluted to the point of being a near meaningless formality. A 1993 survey of US and Canadian medical schools found that only 14% of modern oaths prohibited euthanasia, only 8% forswore abortion, and fewer than half included any clause holding the taker accountable for breaking the pledge. The oath is now widely seen as inadequate for the realities of modern medicine, which involve team-based care, complex technologies, and significant legal and societal responsibilities not mentioned in the original text. Crucially, the Hippocratic Oath has been superseded in practical importance by formal, legally enforceable codes of conduct issued by national medical associations like the American Medical Association (AMA). Violation of these codes, not the ancient oath, can result in disciplinary action, including the loss of a license to practice medicine. This demonstrates a complete transformation. The physician's primary binding promise is no longer a personal vow to a god to prevent harm, but rather a professional obligation to adhere to a legal bureaucratic standard of care designed to manage liability. The focus has shifted from the purity of the doctor's internal commitment to the legal defensibility of their actions within a vast institutional framework. Section 4, A Crisis of Confidence, Empirical Measures of Eroding Trust. The sense of a foundational decay in societal trust is not merely a subjective feeling. It is a measurable, long-term trend confirmed by decades of sociological and public opinion research. Polling data reveals a clear and troubling erosion of confidence in the core institutions of modern life, in the professions that lead them, and most fundamentally, in each other. This quantitative evidence provides a stark backdrop to the historical and philosophical shifts previously discussed, showing that the unraveling of the social contract is a lived reality for a growing number of citizens. 4.1 The collapse of faith in institutions. At the macro level, the most visible symptom of the crisis is the collapse of public faith in major institutions. This trend is not confined to the United States but is a phenomenon spreading across nearly all advanced industrial democracies, suggesting that broad, common social forces are at work. In the U.S., this decline has been precipitous. Pew Research Center studies find a widespread belief that confidence in the federal government is shrinking, a view held by a large majority of the public. This is not a perception of unfair criticism. Fully 75% of Americans believe the federal government does not deserve more public confidence than it currently gets, indicating that the distrust is seen as earned. This erosion of political trust, which began in the mid-1960s and accelerated through crises like Vietnam and Watergate, has continued its downward trajectory, creating a pervasive sense of institutional failure. The long-term decline in Americans' confidence in U.S. institutions directly mirrors the decline in the perceived ethics of the professionals who run them, suggesting a deep-seated and systemic problem. 4.2 The degradation of the professions, a quantitative look. The broad decline in institutional trust is reflected in the public's increasingly cynical view of the honesty and ethics of key professions. Gallup's annual polling on this topic provides a granular look at this degradation, confirming that the professions central to law, religion, and healthcare are suffering from a severe crisis of confidence. The average high or very high ethics rating for a core set of 11 professions has fallen to a historic low of 30%, a significant drop from the 40% or higher ratings that were routine in the early 2000s. The professions that historically served as society's moral and legal arbiters have experienced the most dramatic collapses in public esteem. Trust in the clergy, once a pillar of the community, has plummeted. From an average very high ethics rating of 56% in the period between 2000 to 2009, their rating has fallen to just 30% in the latest poll, a staggering 26-point decline. This erosion is tied to both declining religiosity and high-profile scandals. Similarly, trust in judges has cratered, falling 21 points since the early 2000s to a record low of 28%. This loss of faith in the judiciary means that the very institution designed to be the impartial enforcer of contracts and laws is itself no longer seen as trustworthy by a vast portion of the populace. Healthcare professions, while still rated more highly than others, are not immune. Trust in medical doctors has fallen 14 percentage points since 2021, settling at 53%, their lowest point since the mid-1990s. Even nurses, who have topped the list as the most trusted profession for 23 consecutive years, have seen their rating decline from a peak during the pandemic. At the bottom of the spectrum, members of Congress hold the public's lowest esteem, with a record low ethics rating of just 6%. This data reveals that the crisis is not merely about a few untrustworthy individuals, but about a systemic loss of faith in the roles themselves. The public's confidence in the very mechanisms of judgment, judges, moral guidance, clergy, and governance, politicians, has been shattered, creating a dangerous feedback loop of cynicism, where the societal referees are no longer trusted to call the game fairly. Pipe Profession Pipe 2001 to 2004 AVE Pipe 2019 Pre-Pandemic Pipe 2024 Latest Pipe Point Change 2001 to 2024 Pipe Pipe dash 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 pipe Pipe Nurses Pipe tilde 82% Pipe 85% Pipe 76% Pipe tilde -6 Pipe Medical Doctors Pipe tilde 65% Pipe 65% Pipe 53% Pipe tilde -12 Pipe Judges Pipe tilde 49% Pipe 43% Pipe 28% Pipe tilde -21 Pipe Clergy Pipe tilde 58% Pipe 37% Pipe 30% Pipe tilde -28 Pipe Police Officers Pipe tilde 59% Pipe 50% Pipe 44% Pipe tilde -15 Pipe Members of Congress Pipe tilde 14% Pipe 12% Pipe 6% Pipe tilde -8 Pipe. Data compiled from Gallup Honesty and Ethics polls. Averages for 2001 to 2004 estimated from available historical data. 4.3 The decline of social trust, losing faith in each other. Perhaps the most alarming trend is the erosion of trust at its most fundamental level, between individuals. The crisis extends beyond institutions to interpersonal relationships, suggesting a fraying of the basic social fabric. According to the General Social Survey, the share of American adults who believe that most people can be trusted has fallen significantly, from 36% in 1972 to just 34% in recent polling. This is not a passive observation. A majority of Americans, 71%, actively believe that the level of confidence people have in each other has worsened over the past 2 decades. When asked for the cause, nearly half, 49%, point to a perceived moral decline, stating that trust has fallen because people are not as reliable as they used to be. This finding directly validates the core sentiment of the initial query, a widespread feeling that the man's word has been devalued. This decline in social trust has profound consequences. Research demonstrates a strong correlation between interpersonal and institutional trust. Individuals who have low trust in other people are also far less likely to have confidence in the government, the news media, or the police. This suggests that the institutional crisis is a symptom of a deeper, more personal crisis of faith. When one believes that fellow citizens are unreliable, that distrust is logically extended to the institutions those citizens build and operate. Furthermore, low social trust impedes the ability to solve collective problems, as it undermines the cooperation and reciprocity necessary for a functioning civil society. The decay begins at the micro level of personal interaction and radiates outward, corroding the foundations of the entire social order. Section 5, The Generational Question, a critical examination of the baby boomer hypothesis. The assertion that the degradation of a man's word began specifically with the baby boomer generation points to a critical and disruptive period in Western history. The cultural upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s, led by a vocal segment of this generation, did indeed represent a profound rejection of traditional authority and the values of their parents. However, while the boomers may have initiated the earthquake, a closer look at the data reveals that the subsequent erosion of trust is a more complex, multi-generational phenomenon. The problem is less a single generational failure and more a cumulative trend that has accelerated over time. 5.1 The Great Upheaval, the Counterculture and the Generation Gap. The focus on the baby boomer era is historically justified. The counterculture movement of the 1960s and early 1970s was a powerful, anti-establishment force that explicitly challenged and rejected the conventional mores that had defined post-war society. This was the era of the generation gap, a term coined to describe the profound sense of alienation that many young people felt toward their parents' lifestyles, which they viewed as conformist, materialistic, and spiritually empty. The movement's core tenets were a direct assault on the traditional structures of trust and honor. A deep distrust of government, fueled by the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, became widespread. Social norms regarding sexuality, family, and work were systematically dismantled in favor of personal liberation, individualism, and self-expression. The very concept of honor, with its emphasis on group loyalty and adherence to a shared code, was discredited and replaced with ideals of tolerance, moral relativism, and personal authenticity. The mantra "turn on, tune in, drop out" was a call to reject the established social contract entirely. This period represents the moment when the implicit, honor-based foundations of Western society were consciously and publicly dynamited by a generation seeking a new way of life. 5.2 Values in Conflict, Comparing Generational Work Ethics and Integrity. Examining the documented values of different generations reveals the fault lines created by this upheaval. Each generation, shaped by the unique economic and social conditions of their formative years, developed distinct attitudes toward authority, loyalty, and integrity. Baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964, raised by parents who had endured the Great Depression and World War II, boomers were instilled with a strong work ethic and a future-oriented mindset. They are characterized as being work-centric, competitive, and goal-oriented, valuing loyalty to their employers and respecting authority based on experience and tenure. For this generation, a career was often a central life focus, and they were motivated by extrinsic rewards like promotions and public recognition. Generation X, born 1965 to 1980, often called the latchkey generation, General X grew up with rising divorce rates and less adult supervision, fostering independence and self-sufficiency. They witnessed the institutional failures of the 1970s and developed a more cynical and distrustful view of authority. In the workplace, they rejected the work-centric lifestyle of the boomers, pioneering the demand for a work-life balance. Millennials, born 1981 to 1996, this generation came of age during the digital revolution and a period of heightened awareness of global issues. They are characterized as being collaborative, tech-savvy, and highly motivated by a search for purpose and meaning in their work. They expect their work to align with their personal values, even at the cost of higher pay. However, some research indicates a shift in attitudes toward honesty. A 2017 study by Psych-Tests analyzing integrity traits found that millennials scored statistically lower than both boomers and General X on measures of trustworthiness. Boomers, 81, General X, 80, millennials, 74, accountability. Boomers, 85, General X, 84, millennials, 79, and conscientiousness. Boomers, 80, General X, 79, millennials, 74. The researchers concluded that millennials may view honesty and morality as more of a gray area. This data suggests a complex evolution. While the boomer-led counterculture rejected the form of traditional authority, subsequent generations appear to have internalized a more flexible, or lenient, view of the underlying principles of honesty and accountability themselves. 5.3 A more complex decline, beyond the boomers. While the boomers undeniably initiated a major cultural shift, the empirical data on trust does not support the hypothesis that they are solely responsible for its decline. Instead, the evidence points to a continuous, multi-generational trend that has deepened over time. Sociological research on the decline of social capital, for instance, has found that Generation X, not the baby boomers, led the sharpest drop-off in civic engagement and social trust. In fact, when compared to the preceding long civic generation, baby boomers score quite favorably on these measures. The steady decline in political trust that began in the mid-1960s did not reverse. It continued its downward slide through the formative years of General X and millennials. Furthermore, current data from the Pew Research Center shows that the lowest levels of interpersonal trust are found among the youngest adults. Nearly half of all young adults, 46%, fall into the low trust category, a significantly higher proportion than among older Americans. This indicates that the problem is not a single event in the past but an ongoing process of social change. The degradation of the man's word is not just a legacy of the 1960s. It is also a product of the increasing anonymity, litigation, and complexity of the modern global economy, forces that have accelerated long after the boomers' cultural revolution. The user's hypothesis, therefore, is both insightful and incomplete. The baby boomers can be seen as the generation that broke the machine of traditional honor and authority. They did so with revolutionary fervor, seeking to replace what they saw as a rigid and hypocritical system with one based on authenticity and peace. Subsequent generations, however, did not inherit the revolution, but the rubble. They grew up in a world without those strong traditional structures, where a lack of trust in institutions and a more individualistic moral framework became the normalized starting point. The boomers rejected the old system of trust. Later generations simply grew up without it. This has led to a shift from an external, socially enforced standard of honor to an internal, subjective standard of personal integrity. In a world where every individual has their own truth and their own honor code, a shared, reliable, external standard like a man's word inevitably loses its universal meaning and power. Section 6, Conclusion, Re-evaluating the Foundation. The perception of a society founded on something that doesn't exist is a powerful articulation of a profound and measurable modern crisis. The historical and sociological evidence examined in this report confirms that the binding power of a man's word, whether in the form of a sacred oath, a divine covenant, or a personal code of honor, has fundamentally eroded. However, the foundation of social order has not vanished entirely. Rather, it has undergone a great displacement, a transformation that has created a new set of vulnerabilities that now threaten the stability of the entire structure. 6.1 The Great Displacement, from personal word to systemic process. The core conclusion of this analysis is that societal trust has been displaced. We have transitioned from a system that relied on the personal, sacred word of the individual, enforced by the tangible threats of divine punishment and community shaming, to a system that relies on the impersonal, secular process of the institution, enforced by the abstract mechanisms of law and regulation. The handshake deal, a symbol of personal honor, has been replaced by the multi-page written contract. The priest's moral authority has been superseded by the professional ethics board. The citizen's oath of allegiance to a leader has been abstracted into a citizen's compliance with a vast administrative state. This displacement was not arbitrary but a necessary response to the growing complexity, diversity, and anonymity of modern life. The old systems of honor were simply not scalable. Yet, this transition has come at a great cost. The feeling of living on a foundation that doesn't exist is the direct phenomenological experience of this displacement. The warm, tangible, personal bond of a promise between known individuals has been replaced by a cold, abstract, bureaucratic process. We are bound not by our word to each other, but by our submission to a system. 6.2 The irony of the backup system, when the institutions of distrust also fail. The great irony of our current moment is the failure of the backup system. The entire apparatus of modern contract law and the regulatory state was constructed as a bulwark against the unreliability of the individual. These institutions were designed to function in a low-trust environment, to codify expectations and compel compliance where personal honor could no longer be counted upon. They are, in essence, institutions of distrust. The profound crisis of the 21st century, as evidenced by plummeting public confidence, is that this backup system is now failing. The public is losing faith in the very institutions designed to function in the absence of faith. The catastrophic collapse in trust for judges, members of Congress, and even the clergy reveals a society that not only distrusts its citizens but also distrusts its designated distrust management systems. This creates a trust vacuum far more perilous than the initial decline of honor. If we cannot trust each other's word, and we cannot trust the courts to enforce the contract that replaces the word, then on what basis can a complex society continue to function? 6.3 The generational echo and the path forward. The generational hypothesis at the heart of the query is both historically astute and empirically incomplete. The baby boomer generation did preside over the cultural earthquake of the 1960s that shattered the old foundations of traditional authority and honor. They were the active agents of a great rejection. However, The data clearly shows that the erosion of trust is a multi-generational aftershock, a trend that has continued and, in some cases, accelerated through Generation X and Millennials. The problem is not a single point of failure, but a cumulative unraveling. A nostalgic return to a past honor culture is neither possible nor desirable. The homogeneity and social pressures required to sustain such a system are incompatible with the values of a modern, diverse, and individualistic society. The path forward cannot be backward. Instead, rebuilding the foundation of trust requires a deliberate and sustained effort on two fronts. First, the integrity of our impersonal systems must be radically reinforced. If we are to live in a culture of law, those laws and the institutions that administer them must be worthy of trust. This requires a relentless commitment to transparency, accountability, and ethical rigor in government, the courts, and the professions. The backup system must be made reliable. Second, the fabric of interpersonal trust must be rewoven from the ground up. Sociological research consistently shows that trust and reciprocity are inextricably linked. While a universal honor code may be gone forever, the practice of making and keeping promises can be cultivated in smaller, tangible communities, in neighborhoods, workplaces, and civic organizations. This is not a grand, top-down solution but a slow, bottom-up process of rebuilding social capital. A new foundation can be laid, based not on the fear of God or the threat of shaming, but on the lived, repeated experience of mutual reliability. Only by proving our word to be our bond in our daily interactions can we begin to restore faith in the larger promises that hold our society together.